The day I was dragged into a rain-slicked alley and beaten until my ribs screamed was my sister's 28th birthday. Two men in black hoodies and surgical masks tore my clothes and kicked me with a practiced, rhythmic cruelty. I curled into a ball, my fingers trembling as I reached for my phone to call Grant. He was my husband. He was supposed to be my sanctuary. Suddenly, a shadow flickered in the periphery of my blurring vision. A woman stood there. She looked exactly like me, but her eyes were tired, weathered by a decade of grief I hadn't yet lived. "Don't bother," she said, her voice a hollow echo. "I'm you, 10 years from now." The men behind those masks? "That's Grant and your brother, Harrison." I gasped, a mouthful of copper-tasting blood hitting the pavement. "The footage of you being humiliated is playing on a loop in the family group chat right now," she continued, her gaze fixed on the brick wall. "It's Seraphina's birthday wish. A prank to humble the sister who has everything. Your husband, your brother, your parents, they all decided to grant it." She paused, looking down at my broken form. "Do you want to know what the next 10 years look like? Grant will hand your career-defining projects over to Seraphina. Your parents will call you a dramatic liar until you believe it. 3 years from now, you'll be served divorce papers and kicked out of the house you paid for. You'll end up scrubbing floors in a diner just to afford a motel room." I wanted to scream that she was lying. But my phone buzzed in the mud. I swiped open the group thread. There it was. A video, shot from a high angle, showing me cowering like a stray dog under the boots of the two men I loved most. The tears burned, but I didn't let them fall. I didn't sob. Instead, I felt a cold, crystalline stillness settle over my heart. I saved the video to a hidden cloud drive, took a jagged breath, and dialed 911. "I'm at the alley on 4th and Main," I whispered to the operator. "I've been mugged and assaulted. I need the police. Now." By the time the sirens wailed in the distance, the shadow of my future self had vanished. I hauled myself up against the damp brick, my skin a map of plum-colored bruises. My blouse was rags. A female officer draped a heavy jacket over my shoulders. I didn't play the victim. I gave her my statement and showed her the video from the group chat. Then, escorted by 2 officers, I walked into the private dining room of the Grand Regency Hotel. Inside, the atmosphere was golden and warm. They were singing "Happy Birthday" to Seraphina. A mountain of designer shopping bags sat in the corner, gifts from my parents, Harrison and Grant. Since Seraphina had been lost for 3 years in her early 20s, an abduction she never fully explained, the family treated her like a fragile porcelain doll. Every birthday required 28 separate gifts from each of them to make up for the lost time. Seraphina blew out her candles, leaning into our mother's arms, whispering about how she finally felt safe. That's when they noticed me standing in the doorway. Grant was the first to move. He approached with that same effortless, silver-tongued charm that had made me marry him. "Sienna, honey. What happened? Did you trip? You're a mess, let me get you to a hospital." I stepped back, his hand hanging uselessly in the air. My mother, a renowned chief of surgery, barely looked up from her wine. "It's just superficial bruising, Grant. Don't make a scene. Seraphina is sensitive to the smell of hospitals, it triggers her PTSD. Just go home and clean up." My father didn't even look at me. His voice was heavy with disappointment. "You're late to your sister's dinner, Sienna. Again. Is this some pathetic bid for attention? You know we owe Seraphina a lifetime of peace after what she went through." I felt the air leave my lungs. A bitter laugh bubbled up in my throat. "It's my birthday too, Dad. Did any of you remember that?" The room went silent. For a heartbeat, a flicker of guilt crossed Grant's face, but it was quickly smoothed over. "We'll celebrate yours some other time," my mother said dismissively. "Seraphina is fragile. She shouldn't have to share her moment with outsiders." In years past, that word, outsider, would have shattered me. I would have screamed, cried, and begged them to see me. But today, I simply looked at the door. I didn't come here alone. Uniformed officers stepped into the candlelight. The color drained from the room. Grant's jaw tightened. "You called the cops?" "I was assaulted," I said, my voice steady. "Why wouldn't I?" Harrison, my older brother, lunged toward me, his face contorted in a sneer. "Seraphina is terrified of authority figures. You're trying to trigger her, aren't you? You want her to spiral again. You're a sick, jealous bitch, Sienna." The venom in his voice was a physical weight. I stared at him, then at Grant. "Officers," I said, pointing directly at my husband and my brother. "Those are the men who attacked me. I have the video they filmed of the assault." Despite their frantic claims of it being a family joke or a misunderstanding, the evidence was undeniable. The police took them out in handcuffs, right past the birthday cake. My father slammed his fist onto the table. "You will go down to the precinct and drop these charges immediately, or you are no longer a part of this family. Do you understand? You will not set foot in our house again." I was 3 when they sent me to live with my grandmother in the country because Seraphina was sick and needed their full attention. I spent 18 years begging for scraps of their love, terrified of being exiled again. I reached into my bag, pulled out my key fobs, and slid them across the tablecloth. Fine, I said. As you wish. I'm done living in a house where I never had a room anyway. They stared at me, stunned by my defiance. Seraphina finally rose, her voice a soft, manipulative trill. Sienna, wait. It's my fault. I suggested the prank. I wasn't thinking clearly. You know how my head gets when I'm overwhelmed. I pulled my hand away before she could touch me. They were very calm when they were kicking me, Seraphina. They seemed perfectly lucid. I walked out without looking back. That night, I didn't sleep. Whether the shadow woman was real or a hallucination born of trauma, her warnings felt like prophecy. I opened my laptop and went through every proprietary project I was lead architect on. I embedded subtle signatures, lines of code and design flourishes hidden in the metadata that only I could identify. 2 weeks later, Grant was released on bail. He looked haggard, the golden boy image tarnished. He found me at a coffee shop. I'm sorry, he said, sliding into the booth. I didn't look up from my latte. I don't accept. Grant's lips thinned. I can make this right, Sienna. If you drop the suit, we can go back to the way things were. I'll buy you that house in the Hamptons. I raised an eye. Call the CFO. I want every cent of my project bonuses from the last 3 years moved into my private account by the end of the day. He blinked, startled. You've never cared about the money before. We talked about this, that money was for the college fund. For the baby we're going to have. I stood up slowly. Like you said, Grant. That was before. The coldness in my voice hit him like a physical blow. 3 days, I told him. If the money isn't there, I'm taking the assault footage to the board of directors. He reached for my hand, then pulled back. The firm is tight on cash right now, Sienna. We're partners. Can't you just? You had enough cash to buy Seraphina a $100,000 diamond tennis bracelet for her birthday, I interrupted. Grant gasped. That was meant to be for you. Eventually. He stepped closer, dropping his voice to a seductive whisper. Sienna, please. Once the baby comes, everything will change. I'll put the money in a trust then. Let's just go home. Let me hold you. I stepped back, my hands instinctively covering my stomach. My heart hammered against my ribs. In 7 months, you would have been a father, Grant. The blood vanished from his face. He stared at my midsection. No, that's impossible. I was careful to avoid your stomach when. I pulled the ultrasound and the hospital report from my bag and slapped them onto the table. That last kick you gave me before you ran? You killed your own child. Grant's hands shook as he read the report. He looked up, his eyes rimmed with red. But then, the narcissism took back the wheel. It was an accident, Sienna. I didn't know. Look, we can try again once you've recovered. We have plenty of time for kids. He reached for me again, and for a split second, the old Sienna, the girl who just wanted to be loved, wavered. Then, the shadow woman whispered in my ear, think of who you become if you stay. I went cold. 3 days, Grant. Or the police get the rest of the files. He snapped. He slammed his hand onto the table, knocking over my framed photo of us. The glass shattered, shards spraying across my shoes. I knelt down, picking up the torn remains of the only photo we had together from our wedding day. The glass had sliced right through our joined hands. I can fix it, he stammered, seeing the look on my face. I'll get it restored. His phone rang. It was a high-pitched, childish chime, the special ringtone he had for Seraphina. He hesitated, then answered. Grant? Something's wrong with Sparky, Seraphina sobbed over the line. I think he's having a seizure. I don't know what to do, I'm panicking. Sparky was her Pomeranian. Grant's face instantly shifted from grief to frantic devotion. Don't move, Seraphina. I'm coming. I'll be there in 10 minutes. I stared at him. I took the photo and tore it clean down the middle, handing him his half. Don't bother with the restoration. Grant's patience evaporated. Seraphina has severe clinical depression, Sienna. That dog is her lifeline. If something happens to him, she'll break. Be a grown-up for once and wait for me at home. I'll be back soon. I smiled. It felt like a blade. Last year on my birthday, she called because the dog had diarrhea. 6 months ago, on our anniversary, she called because he threw up. A month ago, when I was stranded in that storm and asked you to pick me up, she said the dog was anxious about the rain. I took a breath. You always say you'll be back soon. You never are. I promise, this time is different, he said, already backing toward the door. He was in such a rush he didn't even notice he was still wearing his indoor loafers. 15 minutes later, Seraphina posted on Instagram. A photo of her sitting on her velvet sofa, clutching the dog, surrounded by my parents, Harrison and Grant. The caption, blessed to have a family that always puts me first. I zoomed in on the photo. Around the dog's neck was a silk ribbon. Hanging from it was the vintage gold locket my grandmother had left me, the one my mother told me she had lost years ago. It didn't hurt anymore. The fire had finally burned everything away, leaving only ash and clarity. The rain had not stopped since the night of Seraphina's birthday, but the dampness no longer soaked into my marrow. It remained outside, beating harmlessly against the tailored wool of the trench coat I had bought with my own private retainer. I sat in the mahogany-paneled office of Arthur Vance, my late grandmother's personal estate attorney. The room smelled of old paper, cedar shavings, and the dry, uncompromising scent of legal finality. Arthur adjusted his wire-rimmed spectacles and pushed a thick manila folder across the desk. You were 23 when your grandmother passed, Sienna. She knew the family dynamics better than anyone. When your mother sent you away at age 3 to raise Seraphina in total seclusion, Evelyn took you in not out of pity, but out of foresight. She left a contingency clause. What kind of clause? I asked. My voice was smooth, stripped of the trembling deference that had defined my early 20s. A revocable family trust, Arthur explained, his finger tapping a sealed wax envelope. Your mother believes she manages the estate in its entirety. But Evelyn stipulated that should you ever be legally severed, disinherited, or physically endangered by members of the immediate family, the entirety of the Mercer ancestral estate, the land holdings in upstate New York, the commercial real estate on Fifth Avenue, and 70% of the primary architectural portfolio royalties, reverts instantly and irrevocably to you. A breath hitched in my throat, not from grief, but from the sudden, sharp realization of how long my grandmother had seen the rot inside our bloodline. She left a letter for you, Arthur added softly. I opened the heavy parchment. My grandmother's handwriting was angular and sharp. My dearest Sienna, they will try to consume you because they are empty, and you are a wellspring. Do not offer them your cup. Break it against their teeth if you must, but never let them make a ghost out of you. I folded the letter, pressing it into my breast pocket right against the bruised ribs that still throbbed with every deep breath. Execute the transfer, I said. Every account. Every deed. Do it silently. Let them discover it only when their credit lines snap. Arthur smiled a thin, wolfish smile. And what of the marital assets with Grant? Sterling? Grant believes he can starve me out, I replied, pulling out my laptop. He transferred $5 million from our joint development account into an offshore shell under Seraphina's name 3 days ago. He thought the private firm's internal ledger was closed to me. I turned the screen toward Arthur. On it was a forensic audit log tracking every single keystroke Grant had made over the past 48 hours. He forgot that I wrote the software architecture for our firm's digital vault. I said. He logged in using my private bypass key. That's felony embezzlement. And corporate fraud. Add it to the criminal assault file. And the project? Arthur asked. The Lumina Tower? The Lumina Tower is the bid of the decade, I said, my gaze cold. The Municipal Committee awards the $40 million commission next Friday at the Apex Gala. Grant wiped my name from the pitch deck yesterday morning and substituted Seraphina's as lead concept designer. He wants to present her as the returning prodigy who conquered trauma through art. Will she be able to present the blueprints? She can barely read a floor plan, I said. And the version Grant stole from my desktop? It contains a deliberate calculation error in the cantilever. Load-bearing calculations. If built according to those specs, the entire atrium collapses. Only the master file on my personal hardware has the correct stress displacement ratios. I stood up, buttoning my coat. Grant wanted to give Seraphina my life. Let him give her the rope to hang them both. The rain turned to sleet as I walked into the lobby of the Mercer Plaza, the luxury high-rise where my parents owned the penthouse. The doorman, an older man named Thomas who had known me since I was a child, paled when he saw me. Miss Sienna, your father left strict instructions with building management. Your access card has been deactivated. I know, Thomas, I said quietly. I'm not here to go up. I'm here for the dog. As if summoned by the mention, the brass elevator doors slid open. Seraphina stepped out, dressed in an oversized cashmere coat, her delicate face framed by a plush velvet scarf. In her arms was Sparky, the Pomeranian. Hovering behind her like an attack dog was Harrison. When Harrison saw me, his jaw hardened, the veins on his neck bulging. What the hell are you doing here, Sienna? You were told to stay away from the family. Mom had to give Seraphina 2 sedatives last night because you terrified her with the police. I didn't look at Harrison. I kept my eyes locked on the small, trembling dog in Seraphina's arms. More specifically, on the antique gold locket dangling from its collar like a cheap trinket. Seraphina shrank back, adopting the wide-eyed, fragile posture that had brought Our entire family to their knees for 15 years. Sienna, please don't yell. At me. My heart is racing. Harrison, tell her to leave. I can't breathe. You heard her, get out, Harrison snarled, stepping between us, his massive frame blocking my path. He had been an all-American collegiate rower, he was used to intimidating people with his physical bulk. You already put Grant in a holding cell for 12 hours over a harmless prank. If you lay a hand on Seraphina, I swear to God I'll break the other side of your ribs. Go ahead, I said, stepping forward until the tip of my umbrella pressed directly against the center of his chest. There are 4K security cameras covering this vestibule, Harrison. You're currently out on a $200,000 bail for aggravated assault and conspiracy. 1. Physical threat recorded on this feed, and the prosecutor revokes your bond. Before sunset. Try me. Harrison froze. The animal rage in his eyes collided with the cold reality of legal consequences. He swallowed hard, his fists unclenched at his sides. I stepped around him smoothly and stood in front of Seraphina. She began to tremble performatively, tears welling in her eyes. Sienna. I'm sorry about the prank. I didn't know Grant and Harrison would go that far. I just wanted us to laugh together like we used to. You never laughed with me, Seraphina, I whispered. You only laughed when I was bleeding. Before she could react, my hand shot forward. My fingers clamped around the gold chain of the locket. With a single, sharp jerk, I snapped the silk ribbon from the dog's neck. Sparky let out a yelp. Seraphina gasped, clutching her chest. My dog. You attacked my dog. This belonged to Grandmother Evelyn, I said, holding the gold pendant up in the light. The intricate floral engraving was scratched, smeared with dog saliva and street grime. My mother told me it was lost in the estate sale 10 years ago. Did you enjoy putting my inheritance around the neck of an animal? Mom gave it to me. Seraphina shrieked, dropping her soft, angelic facade for a fleeting second. Her eyes were sharp, feral. She said you didn't deserve it. Everything Evelyn had should have been mine. You were just the country bumpkin. Dumped on the farm while I was groomed for high society. And look where that grooming led, I said, sliding the locket into my pocket. To an empty girl who has to steal other people's husbands, other people's designs, and other people's heirlooms just to convince herself she exists. Sienna. Harrison yelled, moving toward me. I turned on my heel and pointed my phone directly at his face. The recording screen was live, streaming straight to Arthur Vance's secure server. I'll see you both at the Apex Gala next Friday, I said softly. Make sure. Seraphina studies her architectural notes. It would be such a shame if the city discovered she doesn't know the difference between a load-bearing column and a decorative molding. I turned and walked through the revolving doors into the cold city air. Behind me, Seraphina's hysterical sobs echoed through the marble lobby, but for the first time in my life, the sound brought only profound, crystalline silence. A private investigator named Marcus Cole met me in a dim diner on the industrial fringe of Queens. Marcus was a former detective with 20 years on the NYPD force, unimpressed by wealth, unimpressed by family dynasties, and ruthless with data. He slid a cup of black coffee toward me, followed by a thick dossier bound with a black binder clip. You asked me to look into Seraphina Mercer's 3 missing years, Marcus said, lighting a cigarette despite the diner's no-smoking sign. The waitress didn't even blink. The story your parents sold to the media 8 years ago was that she was abducted from an elite boarding school in Switzerland by an international trafficking ring, held in isolation, and miraculously escaped 3 years later. That was the myth, I said. It was the reason my parents spent $3 million on crisis PR and why every time she dropped a glass or threw a tantrum, we were told she was having a PTSD flashback. It's complete horse manure, Marcus said flatly. He flipped the folder open. Color photographs spilled onto the laminate table. There was Seraphina, suntanned, laughing, holding a glass of champagne on a mega yacht. There was Seraphina at a luxury villa in Ibiza. There was Seraphina in a penthouse in Monaco, draped in diamonds, standing beside a notorious European financier named Julian Vance, no relation to Arthur, but a convicted white-collar criminal who ran a massive Ponzi scheme for Russian oligarchs. She wasn't locked in a basement, Marcus stated. She ran away with Vance when she was 20. She blew through $700,000 of an unauthorized advance against your family's offshore accounts. When Interpol finally raided Vance's compound in Nice, he went down for 12 years. Seraphina cut a deal with the French authorities to avoid an indictment as an accessory. She needed a cover story to come home without facing federal charges in the States and without your father cutting her off. My breath came slow and measured. So she invented the abduction. Not alone, Marcus continued. Her mother, your mother, Dr. Eleanor Mercer, falsified the medical intake forms. Eleanor used her position as chief of surgery at St. Jude's to forge trauma assessments, physical scarring, documentation, and psychological reports. They used the abduction narrative to claim a $4 million payout from an international Lloyd's of London kidnapping policy. The sheer scale of the fraud sat between us like a loaded weapon. Insurance fraud, I whispered. Medical forgery. Wire fraud. Felonies with mandatory minimums of 10 to 15 years in federal prison. Marcus said, tapping the documents. Eleanor would lose her medical license before lunchtime. Your father's hedge fund would be liquidated by the SEC for money laundering through the bogus recovery foundation they set up. And Grant? I asked. Did Grant know? Grant Sterling was Julian Vance's junior accountant in London before he ever met you, Sienna, Marcus said, dropping a final photograph onto the pile. The picture showed a 24-year-old Grant Sterling standing on the deck of that same yacht in Ibiza, his arms slung casually around Seraphina's waist. The world stopped turning for a fraction of a second. Grant didn't meet me by accident at that architectural mixer 4 years ago, I said, the cold truth locking into place with the precision of a guillotine blade. No, Marcus confirmed. He knew you were the real brains and the primary beneficiary of Evelyn Mercer's trust. Seraphina sent him to you. He was supposed to marry you, siphon your creative work and your inheritance, and funnel it back to fund her lifestyle after Vance's assets were seized. The vision of my future self in the rain returned to me. The men behind those masks. That's Grant and your brother. They hadn't just beaten me because Seraphina had a childish whim. They had beaten me to break my spirit completely, to ensure I would remain a docile, brainwashed ghost while they drained the last drop of marrow from my life. I closed the folder with a clean, sharp snap. Make 3 copies of everything, I told Marcus. 1 for the United States Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York. 1 for the New York State Medical Board. And 1 for me. When do you want them delivered? Friday night, I said, standing up. At 8:15 precisely. Right when the champagne is poured for the Lumina Tower announcement. On Wednesday morning, 48 hours before the Apex Gala, I walked into the headquarters of Sterling and Mercer Architecture. The staff went deathly silent. Rumors of the assault had been whispered in the corridors, but Grant's PR team had worked overtime to spin it as a domestic misunderstanding caused by my fragile mental state after a sudden medical issue. I was dressed in an ivory-colored pantsuit, sharp as a scalpel. My hair was pulled back into a sleek, severe chignon. The bruises on my cheekbones were barely visible beneath a layer of matte foundation, but I made no effort to hide the brace on my left wrist. I bypassed the reception desk and pushed open the double-frosted glass doors of the executive boardroom. Grant was sitting at the head of the long walnut table. Flanking him were the 4 primary venture partners and, seated comfortably in the vice chair, Seraphina. She was wearing a blush pink silk dress, looking every bit the delicate muse, her fingers idly turning a diamond pen. Grant jumped to his feet, his face flushing crimson. Sienna. What are you doing here? You are on administrative leave. Security. Cancel the security call, Grant, I said, walking to the foot of the table and placing a leather briefcase on the surface. Unless you want me to explain to Mr. Thorne and the board why the firm's operating account was depleted by $5 million on Monday night without a board resolution. The 4 venture partners, led by the stern, silver-haired Arthur Thorne, immediately stiffened. What is the meaning of this, Grant? Thorne demanded, looking up over his glasses. You told us that transfer was an escrow deposit for the steel procurement on the Lumina project. It was. It is. Grant stammered, his eyes darting between me and the partners. Sienna she's unwell, gentlemen. She suffered a severe personal loss recently and she's projecting her grief. Here is the wire transfer route, I said, sliding 5 copies of the financial audit down the table. The funds went to a shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands under the name Seraph Lilly Limited. The sole signatory on that account is sitting right there. I pointed directly at Seraphina. Seraphina's breath caught in her throat. She looked at Grant with wide, terrified eyes. Grant, what is she talking about? You said that was my creative consulting fee. Shut up, Seraphina. Grant hissed under his breath, his facade cracking in real time. $5 million for creative consulting on a project she hasn't contributed a single line of drafting to? Thorne's voice was thunderous. He stood up, towering over the table. Grant, is this true? It's an internal restructuring. Grant insisted, his voice climbing an octave. Sienna's designs were incomplete. Seraphina stepped in to provide the artistic vision, the emotional narrative that the municipal committee demanded. We have the final renders ready for the gala. Show them, I said calmly, crossing my arms. Grant hesitated, then sneered. He plugged his tablet into the central projector. The massive screen on the wall illuminated with the stunning 3D model of the Lumina Tower, a spiral of glass and titanium reaching 80 stories into the clouds. This, Grant said, regaining some of his swagger, is the design that will win the $40 million city contract on Friday. Authored by the collaborative genius of the Sterling firm. Look at the cantilever on the 62nd floor, Mr. Thorne, I said, pointing at the projection. Thorne, who was an engineer before he became a financier, leaned forward. His brows knit together. The load distribution, the lateral wind resistance isn't compensated for the secondary shear walls. This is structurally catastrophic. Who signed off on these structural calculations? Grant froze. He looked at Seraphina, then back at the screen. That's just a preliminary render. The engineering team. The metadata on that exact file shows that Seraphina Mercer submitted it as the final construction-ready draft 24 hours ago, I said. And embedded within the primary algorithmic framework is my cryptographic signature, S. Mercer, property of Evelyn Mercer Trust. I pulled a hard drive from my pocket and set it gently in front of Thorne. The real calculations, the patented aerodynamic lattice, and the actual structural integrity models are on this drive, I said. And as of 9 o'clock this morning, the intellectual property rights to the Lumina Tower have been officially transferred to my independent firm, Mercer Core Designs. You can't do that, Grant yelled, slamming both hands on the table. You used company resources. I used my grandmother's private server, which I have leased to this firm for 5 years, I replied evenly. A lease that expired yesterday and was not renewed due to non-payment of royalties. You have no designs, Grant. You have an embezzled shell company, a fraudulent pitch deck, and a lawsuit from the city if you dare present that death trap on Friday. Seraphina began to cry, burying her face in her hands. Grant, fix this. You promised me. You promised I would be the face of the project. You said she couldn't do anything to us. Get out, Thorne said, his voice deadly quiet. Grant looked at Thorne, desperate. Arthur, please. Not her, Thorne snapped, his icy glare fixed on Grant and Seraphina. You too. Pack your personal belongings and vacate the building within 30 minutes. The board is calling an emergency session to terminate Grant Sterling as CEO and initiate a forensic audit for grand larceny. You can't fire me. Grant screamed, his face veins bulging purple. I built this company. Sienna built the architecture, Thorne said without looking up from my hard drive. You just handled the marketing. And it turns out you're a thief. As Grant and Seraphina were escorted out by 2 building security guards, Grant stopped next to me. His breath was hot, smelling of sour coffee and bile. You think you've won? He hissed into my ear. Your parents will destroy you. Harrison will make sure you never walk without a cane. You'll die alone. Sienna. I looked into his eyes, the eyes that used to make my heart race with false hope, and saw nothing but a small, terrified parasite whose host had finally walked away. I died in that alley on Seraphina's birthday, Grant, I whispered back. The woman standing here is just the one who came back to bury you. The night of the Apex Architectural Gala arrived under a canopy of freezing rain. The Metropolitan Museum of Art had been rented out for the occasion, its grand marble arches illuminated by golden spotlights that sliced through the dark Manhattan sky. Limousines lined Fifth Avenue, depositing the city's elite, hedge fund billionaires, municipal commissioners, real estate moguls, and European aristocrats. My parents arrived first. Eleanor Mercer looked regal in emerald velvet, dripping in emeralds that had been bought with the settlement money from Seraphina's fake abduction. Beside her, my father, Richard Mercer, adjusted his tuxedo with the smug self-assurance of a man who believed the world revolved around his pedigree. Behind them walked Harrison, glaring at the paparazzi, and Seraphina, who wore a white silk gown designed to make her look like a saint rising from the ashes of tragedy. Grant was with them, his eyes darting nervously across the crowd. Despite his termination from the firm, he had managed to secure entry as Richard Mercer's guest. He had spent the last 48 hours convincing my father that the board's revolt was merely a temporary legal glitch that Richard's money could resolve. Reporters swarmed them at the entrance. Dr. Mercer. Is it true that Seraphina is the lead visionary behind the Lumina Tower? Mercer, how does the family feel about Sienna Mercer's sudden absence from the company? Eleanor smiled with practiced, maternal grace. Sienna is currently taking some much-needed personal time to focus on her health. Family comes first, and we are all so proud of Seraphina for channeling her past hardships into architectural triumph. The Lumina Tower is a symbol of resilience. A symbol of resilience built on lies, a voice rang out from the top of the marble steps. The crowd parted. I walked down the grand staircase alone. I wore a backless gown of midnight blue silk that hugged every line of my body, leaving the fading purple bruises along my shoulders visible like armor. Around my neck hung the vintage gold locket of Evelyn Mercer, catching the flashbulbs in brilliant bursts of fire. Beside me walked Arthur Vance and two federal agents in dark suits. The paparazzi went into a frenzy, shutters clicking like a hail of gunfire. My mother's smile froze. Her eyes dropped to the locket around my neck, and the color drained instantly from her face. Sienna, Richard barked, stepping forward, his voice low and threatening. What is the meaning of this spectacle? You were told to stay out of the public eye. You're embarrassing your sister. Step back, Mr. Mercer, one of the federal agents said, displaying his badge. Special Agent Miller, Southern District of New York. Do not interfere with our escort. Federal agents? Harrison scoffed, trying to shoulder his way past the press. For what? You're bringing the feds to an architecture gala because you're jealous of a birthday party? You're pathetic, Sienna. Harrison, be quiet. Eleanor whispered, her sharp instincts finally sounding the alarm. She stared at the manila envelopes under the agent's arm. Sienna. What have you done? I gave the authorities what you've been hiding for 8 years, Mother, I said, my voice carrying clearly over the muted hum of the room. The medical intake records from the clinic in Nice. The wire transfer receipts from Julian Vance. The $4 million insurance settlement from Lloyd's. Seraphina let out a high, strangled gasp. Mom, make her stop. She's making things up again. She's trying to ruin me. Shut up, Seraphina, I said, not even raising my voice. The French authorities ratified the extradition treaty this afternoon. The file on your 3-year European holiday with a Ponzi scheme operator is open on the mayor's desk right now. The silence that fell over the grand hall was absolute. Hundreds of guests, the very people my parents had spent 30 years cultivating, stared in horror. Ladies and gentlemen, the master of ceremonies announced over the PA system, trying desperately to regain control of the room. The presentation for the Lumina Tower municipal contract will now begin on the main gallery screens. Grant lunged toward the AV podium. Run the tape. Run the presentation file. Now. He thought he could still save it. He thought that if the mayor saw the renders, if the city saw the grand design, the momentum would carry them through the scandal. The massive central screen flickered to life. But it wasn't the 3D model of the Lumina Tower that appeared. It was the high-definition security footage from the alleyway on 4th and Main. The screen illuminated the rain-soaked brick wall. It showed me standing with my umbrella, and then the sudden, brutal ambush by 2 men in black hoodies. The audio piped through the museum's surround sound speakers with sickening clarity. The sound of a fist connecting with my cheek, the sound of my ribs cracking, and then, the voice of Harrison Mercer. Hold her down, Grant. Make sure she doesn't use those hands to draw anything. For a month. This is for making Seraphina cry on her birthday. And then, Grant's voice, cold and laughing. Happy birthday, Seraphina. Let's see how smart she is after this. The footage showed Grant pulling down his surgical mask to spit on my unconscious body before pulling out his phone to film the final kick to my stomach. Screams and gasps erupted across the grand ballroom. Several socialites covered their mouths, backing away in disgust. Harrison stood paralyzed, his eyes bulging as he watched his own face on a 50-foot display. No, that was an internal joke. It was private. You beat your sister until she lost a child for a birthday joke? Arthur Thorne's voice cut through the room like a broadsword. He stood with the mayor and the police commissioner. You monsters. Arrest them, the commissioner said simply to the 4 uniformed officers flanking the entrance. Grant tried to run toward the side exit, but 2 plainclothes officers tackled him directly into a champagne pyramid. The crystal shattered with a deafening crash, showering him in cheap sparkling wine and broken glass. He Thrash screamed on the floor as the handcuffs clicked tightly around his wrists. Sienna. Please. Grant wailed from the floor, his face cut and bleeding. I did it for the firm. Seraphina made me do it. She said she wouldn't sign over the trust unless I broke you. It was all her. You coward. Seraphina shrieked, lunging at Grant while he was pinned by the officers, her manicured nails clawing at his neck. You promised you would take care of her. You promised you would put her in an institution. The officers pulled her off, pinning her arms behind her back. Seraphina Mercer, Agent Miller said, pulling out a set of federal warrants. You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, grand larceny, and making false statements to federal investigators. My father stood frozen in the center of the ballroom, his hands trembling violently. This is a mistake. I am Richard Mercer. I donate millions to this city. And you'll need every penny for bail, Richard, Arthur Vance said, stepping forward with a stack of legal notices. As of 5 o'clock today, the Mercer family trust has been frozen pending a federal asset forfeiture claim. Furthermore, Dr. Eleanor Mercer has been officially suspended from St. Jude's Hospital pending criminal indictment for medical forgery. My mother sank onto the marble bench, her face as white as chalk. She looked up at me, her lips trembling, her hands reaching out in a desperate, pleading gesture. Sienna, my baby. She whimpered. We did it to protect the family name. You always had Evelyn's strength. Seraphina was weak, she needed us, we thought you could handle it. I looked down at the woman who had cast me aside at 3 years old, who had watched me bleed and called it superficial bruising. You didn't think I was strong, Mother, I whispered, loud enough for every camera to capture. You thought I was convenient. But Evelyn gave me her blood. Not yours. And Evelyn never forgave a parasite. I turned my back on them as the police dragged Grant, Harrison, and Seraphina through the front doors, the flashing red and blue lights painting the museum's golden facade in the stark, unforgiving colors of justice. 3 months passed. Winter broke into a fragile, pale spring. The scandal that had erupted at the Apex Gala had consumed the Mercer name entirely. The federal trial moved with terrifying speed. With Marcus Cole's forensic dossier, the surveillance footage, and the cooperative testimony of Grant Sterling, who had turned state's evidence within 48 hours in a pathetic bid to reduce his sentence, the house of cards collapsed completely. Grant was sentenced to 8 years at a federal correctional facility in upstate New York for aggravated assault, corporate embezzlement, and conspiracy. Harrison received 6 years for felony battery and witness intimidation. Seraphina was handed 7 years for federal wire fraud, with mandatory restitution of $3 million to the insurance underwriters. Without her trust fund, her designer clothes, or her doting family, she was remanded to the state penitentiary in Bedford Hills. My parents were stripped of everything. Richard's hedge fund was liquidated to satisfy creditor claims and legal fees. Dar. Eleanor Mercer lost her medical license permanently, her name scrubbed from the surgical wing she had once ruled. On a cold Tuesday morning in April, I stood on the curb outside the Mercer family penthouse on 5th Avenue. A massive moving truck was parked outside. Court-appointed marshals were carrying out antique furniture, oil paintings, and racks of designer clothing for auction. My father sat on a wooden packing crate on the sidewalk, his hair completely white, wearing a threadbare overcoat that smelled of cheap tobacco. Beside him, my mother clutched a battered leather handbag, her eyes vacant and staring at the puddle of dirty rainwater at her feet. When Eleanor saw my car pull up, a sleek, unpretentious black sedan, she scrambled to her feet, her joints stiff with age and despair. Sienna, she cried, stumbling toward the window. Sienna, please. There. Taking the apartment. We have nowhere to go. Your father's pension was seized by the IRS. We're sleeping in a residential motel on 10th Avenue. I lowered the window halfway. The cool morning air flowed between us. You have the country house in upstate New York, Eleanor begged, tears cutting tracks through her unpowdered skin. Evelyn's farm, there are 4 bedrooms. Just let us live in the caretaker's cottage. We won't bother you, Sienna. I'll cook, I'll clean. Just don't leave us on the street. My father didn't look up, but his shoulders heaved with silent, humiliating sobs. The patriarch who had threatened to cast me into the wilderness was now begging for scraps from the daughter he had exiled. The caretaker's cottage has been converted into an architectural studio for underprivileged students, I said evenly. Grandmother Evelyn's foundation is funding 20 full scholarships this year for young women who were abandoned by their families. We are your parents. Eleanor shrieked, the old entitlement flaring for one desperate second before collapsing into terror. You can't just erase us. Blood is blood. Blood is just a biological accident, I said. Family is what you protect. You spent 25 years protecting a lie. Enjoy the harvest. I rolled the window up. Drive, I told the chauffeur. As the car pulled away, I watched in the rearview mirror as my mother fell to her knees on the pavement, screaming my name into the cold Manhattan wind, while the marshals carried my father's golf clubs into the back of the auction truck. I didn't feel joy. I didn't feel malice. I felt the profound, serene lightness of a debt finally settled to the last cent. Before I left New York to take over the reconstruction of the ancestral estate, I made one final visit. The visitor's room at the Otisville Correctional Facility was gray, sterile, and smelled of industrial bleach and institutional despair. I sat behind the plexiglass partition. A minute later, Grant Sterling was led into the room by a guard. He looked unrecognizable. The golden boy haircut had been shaved to a buzz cut. His posture was hunched, his jaw covered in patchy stubble, and his left eye bore a half-healed yellow bruise, the currency of prison life. He picked up the heavy plastic telephone with shaking hands. I picked up mine. "You came," he whispered, his voice cracked and hollow. I thought you'd never look at me again." "I came to deliver the final decree," I said, holding a single sheet of paper against the glass. "The divorce was finalized by the judge yesterday morning. My maiden name has been legally restored. Every patent, every royalty, and every asset associated with the Sterling name has been dissolved." Grant closed his eyes, a single tear cutting through the dirt on his cheek. "Sienna. I'm sorry. I know that doesn't mean anything now, but every night when the lights go out, I see you in that alley. I see the blood on your blouse. I didn't want to hurt you. Seraphina told me that if we didn't break you, you would leave me. She said you were planning to take the firm and abandon me." "Seraphina was projecting her own soul onto me," I replied. "And you were stupid enough, and greedy enough, to believe her." "Is it true?" he choked out. "About the baby?" The question hung in the air, heavy and sharp. I looked at the man I had once thought would hold my hand into old age. "It was true," I said softly. "A little girl. She would have had your hazel eyes. But she will never have to know that her father was a coward who traded her life for the approval of a sociopath." Grant dropped his head against the shelf below the glass, his shoulders shaking, as he wept with a deep, guttural agony that echoed through the cold visiting room. "I have nothing left, Sienna," he sobbed. "Nothing. When I get out of here in 8 years, I'll be 42 years old with a felony record and not a single dollar to my name. What am I supposed to do?" "You can scrub floors in a diner," I said, remembering the words of the shadow woman in the rain. "I hear it builds character." I hung up the receiver, stood up, and walked through the heavy steel doors without turning back. 1 year later, the morning sun broke over the Hudson River, bathing the city skyline in ribbons of liquid gold. A crowd of thousands had gathered at the construction site on the waterfront. Massive steel cranes stood against the clear blue sky like modern monuments. At the center of the stage stood the scale model of the Lumina Tower, not the flawed, stolen draft, but the breathtaking, aerodynamic masterpiece that was now being hailed as the future of sustainable urban design. The mayor of New York took the podium. "Today, we break ground on a project that represents more than just architectural brilliance," the mayor announced into the microphones. "It represents the unyielding triumph of integrity, resilience, and vision. Ladies and gentlemen, the founder of Mercer Core Designs and the lead architect of the Lumina Tower, Sienna Mercer." The applause was a roar that seemed to shake the very ground beneath the stage. I walked up the steps in a simple, elegant cream-colored suit. The morning breeze caught my hair, lifting it from my shoulders. There were no bruises on my skin. My ribs had long since healed, knit together with new bone that felt stronger than the old. I adjusted the microphone and looked out over the sea of faces, brilliant young architects, trusted partners like Arthur Thorne, and hundreds of citizens who had come to see the beginning of something new. "A building is only as strong as its foundation," I said, my voice steady and resonant. "If you build on sand, on greed, or on the suffering of others, the highest tower will eventually collapse under its own weight. But if you build with truth, if you anchor your pillars in the bedrock of who you truly are, no storm on earth can tear you down." I turned to the ceremonial silver shovel, thrust it deep into the earth, and turned the first sod of soil. Confetti rained from the scaffolding, catching the sun in millions of brilliant, dancing sparks. That evening, I drove alone up to the Hudson Valley estate. The old Victorian farmhouse stood amidst rolling hills of green, surrounded by ancient oak trees whose leaves rustled softly in the spring twilight. The air smelled of damp earth, blooming honeysuckle, and absolute peace. I walked into the master bedroom on the second floor. The room had been completely restored, painted in soft tones of warm linen and sage. On the nightstand sat the framed photo of my grandmother Evelyn, her sharp, knowing eyes looking out from the silver frame with unmistakable pride. I walked over to the antique full-length mirror near the bay window. The twilight was fading, casting long, soft shadows across the polished oak floorboards. I looked into the glass. For a heartbeat, the air in the room grew completely still. The temperature dropped just enough to raise the hair on my arms. In the reflection of the glass, the shadow flickered. A woman stood behind me in the mirror. She wore a tailored charcoal coat, her hair streaked with elegant silver at the temples. But this time, her eyes were not weathered by 10 years of scrubbing diner floors. Her eyes were not hollowed by grief, betrayal, or poverty. Her eyes were bright. Her posture was straight and unyielding. She looked at me with a soft, radiant smile. "You changed the ledger," she whispered, her voice no longer an echo from an alleyway, but a melody of triumph. I remembered who I was, I replied in the silence of the room. The woman in the mirror nodded slowly. "You won't have to wait 10 years to be free, Sienna. You're already home." A warm breeze blew through the open window, carrying the scent of lilac into the room. When I blinked, the shadow was gone. There was only me, standing tall in the golden evening light, holding my own life in my own hands, whole, unbroken, and finally sovereign.